One of the exciting things about the Shadow Woods project initially is that we got all the data through what is known as citizen science. We work with local communities. From our knowledge of woodlands that we built up over about 20 years, looking at history, looking at ecology, which is my own background, we had lists of indicator species. So we can walk into a fantastic ancient woodland like Ecclesall Woods in Sheffield, and we can list maybe 20 or 30 species which tell us by their presence or by their frequency or their abundance about the history and continuity of the woodland. And we use these to identify ancient woodlands. So that's a woodland that is officially dated before 1600. It gets confusing because if you're in Scotland it's sometime after 1700. So it varies from Carlisle to Gretna Green, which is a bit unhelpful. But the species can be read like a book. So some of them are really, if you find those, it's a red letter day. They're really uncommon. They are only found on really good quality ancient woodland sites. So you might have about 10 species that are really like that. Then you have another 10 which they're pretty good indicators. They occur in some habitats elsewhere, and then you've got others which are in woodlands but not necessarily totally confined to ancient woodlands. So that was where we came from with this. And then we looked at these species, and one of the clues to the Shadow Woods was that we were finding in non-woodland habitats species that are supposedly woodland species. And I can remember as a student at Lancaster University, we didn't know much about plants, taken to a woodland and been shown this is a bluebell, this is an ancient woodland, this is bluebell, this is dog's mercury, this is stitchwort, this is honeysuckle. These are woodland plants. And then we were taken onto a moorland or heathland, and they said this is heather, that's a moorland plant, this is, yes there's bluebell, yes there's honeysuckle, they shouldn't be here, ignore them, they're woodland plants. And they sort of stuck in my mind that these indicators were actually not only found in the woodlands. And the reason is it goes back to the origins of the woods and the wood pastures in that wider pre-Doomsday landscape. That's where it all came from. And in the woodland, you've enclosed the wood and then you've managed it, and that management has removed all the non-woodland species, the species that can't cope with shade and with the boom bust of management. So you end up with species that we now view as woodland species. But those woodland species originated in the wood pastures, and they occur in the wider landscape. They occur in bogs, in fens, in heaths, on moors, not in the abundant, the massed bluebells that we get in a woodland, but they do occur in that wider landscape. So what we then did was to identify species which we thought might occur in the shadow woodlands, and we trained up the volunteers and produced guides for the volunteers to recognise a suite of maybe 15 fairly common species. And then we identified places on the maps, and we went out on site with the volunteers and said, look, this is stitchwort, so we record it like this. This is creeping softgrass. This is on the moorland. This really is indicating either maybe a lost wood, a ghost wood, or a shadow woodland. And we train people up to recognise all these, and then we sent them out into the wilderness to map indicators, and they did all the work. And the exciting thing then is that pulls you in to the sites which are these relic landscapes, these little bits of a glimpse of the Doomsday, which is fantastic, but also it guides you into places where you might productively trigger new woodland. Because a lot of the trees have gone, they were removed by farmers in the 1800s. They were prevented from regenerating because of intensive sheep in the 1960s, 70s, etc. But we can allow them now to come back, and this can guide us into those places where it will be most productive. And the other exciting thing is, for anyone who's ever read any of the stuff by a friend of mine, Ted Green, who's obsessed with the fungi that power trees, the mycorrhizal fungi that power the trees, this is the unseen biodiversity, and all the other biodiversity that's in the soil. these relic bits indicated by the flowers will most likely have the fungi still surviving, the fungi and the bacteria and the microarthropods of a woodland. So it's bringing you into where the trees used to be, and you can then start to think, well, how do we unleash nature and the power of nature to create new woodlands? And that is really powerful, because when you're planting a tree, you stick it in the ground. It might be in an old pasture or something like that, or an old arable site. It will do its best, but it's not come with all that hidden biota which makes it a wood. It may take 500 years to get that. With a shadow woodland, it's there. It's just waiting to be set free, which I think is a really powerful thing. And by training volunteers to do that, they have ownership of that process. They discover the sites. They can then see the trees coming back. And it won't just be the trees, it's all that biodiversity, that hidden biodiversity, that make the rainforest what it is. Within the Borrowdale area and the wider Cumbrian landscape, there are lots and lots of shadow woodland areas. As I say, you see the patches of woodland indicators on the fell sides, you see the little clumps of ancient but small trees, often gnarled holly bushes and things like that, which people often don't even look at. But you go and look at the holly trees, for example, grow incredibly slowly, about 1 millimetre a year. And they love that humid. They are very much a plant of the humid Western influence. You go into Europe and you lose them because it's continental climate, it's dry. The holly is really important. And holly it's eco-cultural. It's an ancient tree, and they grow clonally. We've got some in Ecclesall Woods that are probably nearly 1,000 years old, but nobody recognises them because they grow as a clone. They spread out 1 millimetre a year over centuries. And they were harvested to produce green fodder, leaf fodder, to feed deer or livestock. So you'd either coppice them or pollard them, and in the winter that's what farmers fed to their sheep over centuries. And those trees are still there in the landscape. You often don't see them. They'll be up on the crags, up on the fell sides. Now you can send people out and they can start to map out. Have you seen any crags where there are old oak trees, multi-stemmed oak trees? Are there any with old holly bushes? So something, a holly bush that sort of diameter stem is probably 300, 400, 500 years old, but people just don't see it, they don't recognise it. So you can look at indicators like that. The trees are really important, the indicator species are important, they direct you to the shadow woods. Now very often you'll have lost a lot of the trees because the regeneration is affected by the over-intensive grazing that a lot of the fells have experienced. But they can come back, and they will come back. And one of the exciting things I've seen in the Peak District where I do a lot of my work, but also elsewhere in the country, such as in the lakes, the trees are coming back in the same places from which they were removed. You can see this, you can see it on the maps. You can get the maps from the 1800s and you can see areas. The map makers, the cartographers then, often marked individual trees on the maps. If you look at the 6-inch maps of the time, they mark the trees. And you can sometimes see those trees still in the landscape today, ancient hawthorns, ancient hollies, ancient oak trees. But also you can see areas which were treed, and there are no trees now. And what I have seen in the last 20 years, when the conditions have been made right, is the trees come back from those exact same places that they were removed, which is really exciting. So they know where they should be. I don't want to anthropomorphise this too much, but the trees come back from the habitat where they were removed. Mm-hmm. It's a process I call ecological filtration. The conditions are right. It's like with the lichens are coming back into these areas where the conditions are suitable and when the conditions are suitable. The lichen spores and particles have always blown in, say, to the Peak District from Snowdonia in North Wales and from Cumbria. They were always there, and the westerly winds carried them over here. The only thing was they dropped down on Sheffield or Manchester, and they go, no, get us out of here, this is horrible and polluted. Well, now that air pollution's gone, and they land on a tree or a boulder, and they're growing. And it's this process of what we call ecological filtration. We've even got it with some of the ferns. I mentioned before, shield ferns, soft shield fern, hard shield fern, golden scaled male fern are often indicators of these really wet, humid woods. The sort of thing that people will be familiar with walking into an Atlantic rainforest. Branches festooned with polypody and things like that. Well, for centuries, those were removed. They were removed by fern collectors, but they're also eliminated by pollution. And now we've got them coming back into areas. And within 20 years, it looks like they've always been there. And I've had people who are fern enthusiasts who have surveyed a site and said, oh, we found this is an ancient site for this particular fern species. I say, no, it's not. We surveyed it 30 years ago. They weren't there. They've come back. Ecological filtration. So the bits that are not suitable, the spores will land and they don't thrive. But where the conditions are right, they come back, and you start to see these woods re-emerge as proper Atlantic rainforest. You know, given time, nature will come.